They Were Her Property by Stephanie Jones Rogers. Again, this is research. This is a dissertation turned into a book from 2013 from one of UC Berkeley's professors that is really expanding and illustrating the depth of slavery. If it could be more pervasive, this research definitely adds to that. It's really talking about it's adding to the literature of American slavery the extent to which this was a social and economic reality, whereas it has been misrepresented as a male dominated occurrence, that it was a regular practice, it was a common practice, it was a legally endorsed practice of white women, and particularly wealth building through the slave, and even more specifically through the female slave. Women typically inherited more slaves than land, and women employed the same management techniques as effective and as brutal as men. There are different accounts. Some come from articles, legal paperwork, wills, but also oral histories as well from formerly enslaved people. And one thing that was really, really unique, and I wish you would have spent more time in it because it could have been a dissertation itself, was how much slaves had to understand the business of the people that owned them. Because if my family can be broken up based on how well the slave master is doing, over time they began to learn how to keep account of how well the slave master was doing, because that had a direct effect on punishment, that had a direct effect on their families being broken up, that had a direct effect on any probability of freedom. So when they were giving these oral histories, they had acute knowledge of the intricacies of intestacy in the American South, and how people wrote their wills, because there were several court cases where slaves went to court and sued for their freedom. Obviously, you had to have a white person represent them, but had pointed out, no, this is how the will was written, this is where the will was recorded, and this is supposed to be the outcome of the will. Now, in most cases, it did not work out in the favor of the slave, but in some cases it did. Now, that generally would deal with the white person that was actually trying to not follow the will or do something nefarious in the business, as to where they were taking the slaves either for payment, or the mother said, when I die, free this person. And they were like, oh, it's a free slave. No, I'm just going to give him to my sister. There were different occurrences as to where the slaves challenged their status because they understood the business of slavery. So that fallacy of them not being educated was incorrect. There's a difference between educated and being schooled. They weren't schooled, but those people were learned. White women actually actively participated in the slave market, profited from it, and used it for economic empowerment. They understood the value of wealth, and at some point, they understood it to the extent to which they focused on which slaves they got or kept, because what white women began to do, not exclusively, but in this research, white women particularly did this, began to covet female slaves. Now, it was for two different reasons. Parents were giving female slaves to women to make sure that their lives were taken care of, because females were generally, be it slave or white, free, were geared more toward domestic things, or domestic skills. So parents gave the daughters female slaves because they would help her. Many times they weren't trying to help the new husband, but they wanted the daughter to have a easy, relaxing life. Well, what began to transpire later, after the Atlantic slave trade was shut down, they began to use these females as breeders. And we're talking about people having like 20 babies. They were forcing these women to basically suffer sexual assault to produce kids. And there was a story in the research where a woman beat a slave because she couldn't conceive. Now, I would imagine in a state of perpetual PTSD, conceiving had to be very hard. I would imagine the prenatal care, not just technology, but just the lack of investment in slaves, caused a high infant mortality rate. So these women were being used for their reproductive nature. So it's not just white women in slavery, it's another history of white women and black women. Because these women who were constantly pregnant were obviously constantly lactating. And these women were forced to nurse not just the black kids, but the white kids as well. So it adds to the breadth and depth of the psyche of the country at that time, as it dealt with slaves and slavery. Because this was white women's primary source of wealth. It was almost like a dowry. So poor white men were looking for white women that had already been gifted a lot of slaves, which allowed these men to invest deeper in slavery, which broadened it. So white women were very they were a very significant part in the development and stabilization of chattel slavery. This was a reason why a lot of white women opposed emancipation. Why is that important? When you're talking about the Civil War, there are many misrepresentations about why that war was fought and what the interests were from Union white soldiers, Confederate white soldiers, and Black Union soldiers. There were three different agendas. White people were not fighting the Civil War for the indignity, to end any indignity, abuse, or humanity or morality associated with slavery or Black people. The Black people were. And that is why you will hear some people say that Black people freed Black people in the Civil War, because the North was losing the Civil War as of in January 1st, 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation allowed Black regiments to be formed to assist in the Civil War. And it's just a matter of historic record that after these Black regiments came in, the war shifted toward the North. And even the Confederate Army started thinking about empowering the slaves to be more than labor moving things, that they were going to help them fight. And then it was like, well, wait a minute. A, we don't trust if we give them guns, they're not going to shoot us. And B, empowering them as equals is what the whole the Confederate paperwork is against. So that never happened. But it's a unique work. It's a solid work, a little repetitive, and I did not like, and I'll probably email her. I would like to know why, when they interview slaves and they do that Langston Hughes broken slave language, which was actually quote unquote poorly speaking or dialectically selected English, where they use that der, and you know what the person meant. Just write what the person meant. I don't like when they do that. It's like they're poking fun at the people's intelligence. So I asked her why she made that choice. It does feel a bit overly specific, to the point that it seems a little redundant. It's not hard to read though, and it is interesting. So again, they were her property.